My name is John DeMiranda, and I'm the CEO of Stepping Stone of San Diego, and a new program that's about to come online called Pomaro, and there's a couple of flyers there about that. Stepping Stone is a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender treatment program that serves a lot of people with HIV, and that's the advertisement for that. The other hat that I wear is I'm on the board of directors of Faces and Voices of Recovery, which is a national addiction recovery advocacy organization. And I'm here to talk about how recovery and recovery-oriented systems of care are really kind of the new paradigm. I think one of the ways to think about the work we do is that way back in the 30s and 40s and 50s and probably up until the 60s, the paradigm was really mutual aid. It was 12-step, people helping each other. Occasionally somebody might open up one of their homes or their house to other people, and you had a very kind of mutual aid orientation to helping people recover. There was no professional treatment. There was no organized recovery community. Then in the late 60s and 70s, we began to see with some federal funding a shift to what you might call social model programming, where those recovery homes and those informal kind of mutual aid relationships got some funding from the federal government. In fact, the Hughes Act of 1970 was really the beginning of that. Harold Hughes was a congressman who was in recovery, and he kind of got that going. Then things started to get very professional. We had a lot of professional treatment, and you can still see lots of that today. But in some ways, the paradigm is changing, and instead of just focusing on treatment, we're now seeing people appreciating the broader recovery community and how it can create opportunities for recovery independent of treatment. One of the factoids I'd like you to think about as we go through this workshop is that for every one person who goes through the treatment door into long-term recovery, there are 5 that don't go through treatment. Those 5 individuals recover through different paths. Maybe it's their church. Maybe it's like George Bush. They kind of woke up one day and said, I'm not going to do any more youthful indiscretions. Maybe it's through the 12-step door, okay? But all of those people, when they're in early recovery, don't have a lot of supports in communities if they're not coming through the treatment door. If they're coming through the treatment door, maybe they'll get some aftercare. Maybe they'll be referred out to other services if there's been a good case management component in their treatment program. But more likely than not, they're going to come out of treatment without a whole lot of connectivity to the community. So creating recovery-oriented systems of care is really about what we call building recovery capital in a community, making communities more recovery-friendly so that there are supports for everybody. And that's really what this presentation is going to talk about. And just for a minute before we get started, if you take this little test, we will use this as a learning device after the PowerPoint to see what you know now and maybe what you've learned as a result of the workshop. And I don't expect you to know a lot of this, but think about it, and I'll give you the answers when we get further along. Okay, I know that wasn't enough time, but let's kind of cruise through the PowerPoint, and maybe we can be out of here a little bit early, since there probably won't be a lot of questions from the three of you. Okay, so communities of recovery are springing up all over the country, helping people find and sustain their recovery from addiction to alcohol and other drugs for the long term. People in recovery, families, friends, allies will organize and mobilize as a constituency of consequence in thriving recovery community organizations. This is an important element of recovery-oriented thinking. Right now, we have lots of constituency groups in this country. If you're an elected official, you want to run for office, kind of that's, in the wind these days, you're thinking about the women's vote, the Latino vote, maybe you're even thinking about the gay vote, okay? But you're not thinking about the recovery community vote. And that's what we want to change. We want people to begin to think that there is an organized recovery community out there, that it's a constituency of consequence that needs to be taken into account. We recently had the first real solid number of people in recovery in the United States that just came out. The Partnership for Drug-Free America did a study. It had pretty sound methodology. It was 1,000 phone calls to people, and an estimation of how many people in recovery there are in the United States. Any guesses? 15%. So that would be about 30. Well, it's 23 million people are in recovery, not friends and family, but 23 million in recovery is the estimate. We think that's probably low, but that's a lot of people. That's a lot of votes, and that's a lot of people to be in the closet. We want to kind of bring those people out of the closet and make the constituency of consequence evident. And discrimination against people in or seeking recovery, and that's a term that's used a lot in the recovery community. People in, seeking, or in need of recovery, as opposed to addicts and alcoholics. Okay? Let me give you an example of how at Faces and Voices we're kind of rethinking our messaging. For years, if you've been in this field, you've bemoaned the fact that the public doesn't get it, despite the fact that we keep hitting them over the head with it's a disease, they don't get it. So we've done some survey work at Faces and Voices, and we've learned some things about how the public hears our message. And as a result of this, I don't introduce myself in public the way I used to. And that sounded something like, "Hi, my name is John. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I'm here to talk to you today about why you should put more of the county budget into recovery or into addiction treatment." That's kind of the way I used to do it, okay? We don't do it that way anymore because the public hears all that and they do a bunch of things. Here's what happens. They hear, "He's not telling us what his last name is. Why is he doing that? Why is he hiding his identity? His name is John." All right? And then because I say I'm a recovering alcoholic, when the public hears recovering, what do you think they think that means? He's still trying. He's still trying. He's not recovered. He's still trying. Well, that's not what I want them to know about me. Alcoholic, he's a recovering alcoholic. That term alcoholic, just like drug addict, we know from the public has an automatic negative reaction. So we don't talk about alcoholism, addiction. We talk about recovery. Okay? So now when I introduce myself in public, based on what we've learned about this messaging, and because I want the people who hear me to really understand what I'm talking about, I introduce myself this way. "Hello, my name is John DiMiranda. I'm a person in long-term recovery. And in my case, that means I've not used alcohol or drugs for 36 years. Because I don't want them to confuse me with a cancer survivor or a chocoholic recovering person. I want them to know exactly what I'm talking about." So we use that kind of messaging to eliminate discrimination, eliminate misunderstanding. A couple of years ago, Faces and Voices promulgated a recovery Bill of Rights. And if you go to our website, you can download the poster, tack it up on your wall, and become a recovery advocate. The Bill of Rights is all about improving the lives of millions of Americans, their families and communities, if we treat addiction to alcohol and other drugs as a public health crisis. To overcome this crisis, we must accord dignity to people with addiction and recognize there is no one path to recovery. So we have efforts to mainstream recovery. In fact, if you happen to be a delegate to either the Republican or the national political conventions for presidential election this year, you can go to a recovery hospitality room that Faces and Voices operates at the conventions. And this individual, if he looks familiar, is Patrick Kennedy, son of Robert Kennedy, who is in long-term recovery from addiction. Well, that's a good point. You know, I tend to say anybody who's in recovery should use the term long-term recovery when they're talking to the public, because it gets a message across that people are in recovery for long periods of time. In reality, William White, who's one of my heroes and who's done a lot of thinking about our field, he talks about early recovery being like the first year or two, sustained recovery being maybe 2 to 5 years, and then 5+ being long-term recovery. He uses that designation, but there is no, hard and fast rule. But if you're talking about recovery as opposed to addiction, you're talking about shifting from a crisis-oriented, professionally directed acute care approach, kind of like what's going on in the exhibit hall over there, with its emphasis on isolated treatment episodes, to a recovery management approach that provides long-term supports and recognize that there are many pathways to health and wellness. Recovery is a process. Recovery from alcohol and drug problems is a process of change through which an individual achieves abstinence and improved health, wellness, and quality of life. Here's William White. The recovery model wraps traditional interventions in a continuum of recovery support services. Particularly distinctive is the model's emphasis on post-treatment monitoring and support, long-term stage-appropriate recovery education, peer-based recovery coaching, assertive linkages to communities of recovery, and when needed, early intervention, reintervention. Now that's not kind of what you're going to see over there with all the treatment programs. There it's 30 days and you're out. Relapse, come back maybe for 2 more weeks and you're out. These kinds of acute care episodes are really limited, and there's nothing, I'm not trying to take away from that approach, but it's really not about long-term recovery. This kind of approach requires community building, requires developing capital in communities, and one of the handouts that you have is about an effort in San Diego where we're starting a recovery community organization, which you'll hear about in a few minutes. Well, actually, you'll hear about it right now. How do you develop policies, communities, in a society that are recovery friendly? One part of making this happen is to create something called recovery-oriented systems of care or recovery community organizations. And that, by the way, is Lou Gossett, the actor, who spoke at one of our rallies recently, a person in long-term recovery. So recovery-oriented systems of care mobilize all of the resources in communities to do a lot of different things. Change discriminatory public policies in areas of healthcare, jobs, and housing to eliminate barriers. You know, if you are a young college student today and you want to get a student loan, well, today we've changed this, but a couple of years ago, you couldn't get a student loan if you had a drug felony on your record. If you were a murderer, you could get the student loan, but not if you had a drug felony. This is the kind of the differential way our criminal justice deals with demonizing people with drug addiction backgrounds. You also want to develop networks and systems that work together to treat addiction as a public health crisis and accord dignity to people with addiction. And you want to help more people find and sustain long-term recovery by building on the strengths and resilience of individuals, families, and communities as individuals take responsibility for their long-term recovery, health, and wellness. You also want to make services and resources available that people can use to meet their needs. One of the things we're doing in San Diego, because so many people are in recovery but don't have a lot of recovery supports, we're starting a recovery coaching initiative where actually Monday morning, when I get back to San Diego, I'm going to spend the next 5 days training about 20 people to be recovery coaches. So when our graduates come out of Stepping Stone and go into maybe a sober living program or maybe go back to whatever their life was before treatment, they can have a recovery coach at no cost to them who will be with them for 3 to 6 months meeting with them on a regular basis to coach them in their recovery. So, people may need professional treatment, but there are a variety of supports that work for and with each person to restore their lives. That's the ongoing process. One way to think about this historically is that there is this large recovery community. It's often underground. It's often, in a closet. One of the ways I could tell if there was a lot of recovery community around was you drive around on a Saturday night and you check out the church parking lots. Okay? If they're full on a Saturday night, well, at least you know there's a strong 12-step community in that community. But for the most part, the recovery community is kind of hidden. Then kind of a subset of the recovery community is the treatment field. And maybe there are many people in the treatment programs who are in the recovery community, but usually there's not a lot of interaction between the two in a formal way. There's supposed to be a slide here with a bridge. There it is. Okay. There's the bridge. Recovery-oriented systems of care build that bridge. And the reason I'm here at this workshop, while there's so much about treatment here, is to try and think in terms of building that bridge. So, what's the equation? Individuals seeking help in their loved ones, effective quality addiction prevention, treatment and recovery support services, and the recovery community are the equation. People in recovery from alcohol and other drug addiction, family, friends, and allies. We have a lot of allies. And we know that in order to have a good recovery-oriented system of care, you need a lot besides treatment, because people need a lot of stuff besides treatment. And if they haven't gone through that treatment door, they still need a lot of stuff. They often need help with housing. They often need help with legal issues. They may have a bench warrant hanging over their head. They may have an old felony warrant out that they need help with. Often they have a lot of health care issues. They need dental care, they need health care, employment, etc. Now, if they've been through a treatment program where there's some good case management and maybe some good aftercare, some of these things have started to happen. But if they've just walked into a 12-step program or come out of a church and decided they're going to stop using, where do they get this help? Okay? What we're trying to do is build recovery communities where that help is available. Now, this slide was developed by Dr. Wesley Clark, who is the director of the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment. He has an MPH, a PhD, a JD, and something else. And you can tell from the slide that he's got 6 degrees. So we're going to skip this slide and keep it kind of simple. So communities of recovery include recovery community organizations. And we're not talking about treatment, and I'll talk a little bit more about what an RCO is. Mutual support groups. Now, here's a terminology issue. At Faces and Voices, we use the term mutual aid, mutual support. We eschew, everybody know what I mean by eschew? We avoid the term self-help, because when the public hears self-help, it reinforces the public's belief that you should just pick yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Self-help. That's not what 12-step is. That's not what peer support is. It's really mutual aid. So we use mutual aid all the time. Recovery homes, recovery schools, solid recovery media and entertainment. I mean, people in a community who are in recovery need other places to go on a Saturday night besides bars and dance halls. So having, supportive, recovery-oriented entertainment is a part of building a recovery community. Now, these are some of the recovery community organizations around the country that supports Faces and Voices and support their local communities. I wanted to learn how to become a recovery coach. So 4 weeks ago, I went to Rutland, Vermont, and spent 5 days with Friends of Recovery Vermont, because they have been doing recovery coaching for a number of years. They've got a great curriculum. I went there to learn it. Now we're going to be bringing it to San Diego to develop that capacity there. This is a fairly old PowerPoint. There's now about 400 RCOs around the country. And they're all different. They range in size from just a few people, lots of volunteers, no money, to fairly substantial, well-endowed and well-funded organizations. There is actually a federal grant program that if you're lucky enough to get one of those, you have funding for a substantial period of time and can really help to organize your community. They are independent, nonprofit organizations. They're led and run by representatives of local communities of recovery on behalf of the recovery community. There's a phrase in the disability world where organizations that serve people with disabilities are supposed to be of, by, and for. Run of, by, and for the disability community. And recovery community organizations are the same thing. They're governed by people in recovery, and they're run by and for and of the recovery community. They do a lot of things. They don't do treatment. They do a lot, but they do a lot of other things. They do public education. They put a face and a voice on recovery. They do advocacy. They work with their local elected officials to make sure there's adequate treatment, make sure there's adequate support for people in recovery. And here's the service part. They do peer-based and other recovery support services. Maybe it's recovery coaching. Maybe it's other kinds of mutual support for people in recovery. They don't do addiction treatment. They do recovery support. So a recovery community center, often run by a recovery community organization, is a physical location where recovery community organizations organize their ability to care and to advocate. We have a hope that someday in San Diego there's going to be a storefront called Recovery Central. And that anybody who's new to recovery, or anybody who's talking to somebody who's new to recovery, or maybe even somebody who's in need of recovery, can go to that storefront, get all the information about what is available in the community, be linked up with the Alano Club, maybe find a coach, maybe find a treatment program if they need it. And maybe on a Saturday night come for coffee and music. So the Recovery Central builds that recovery capital in that community. Let me skip over all the various funding sources for RCOs, but talk more about peer recovery support services. It can be one-on-one support. It can be recovery coaching, as we've been talking about, or mentoring. It could also be support groups. You know, there might be, let's say, an Alano Club where there's a number of people who are concerned about the fact that so many people at the 12-step community are having difficulty with finances, or maybe having difficulty with employment, which is something that, you know, is kind of true today, and especially the past few years. So maybe at the Alano Club, some persons in longer-term recovery decide, well, let's start a support group for people who are looking for jobs and in recovery, where people can come and share their experience. How do you answer those questions about your background? How do you talk about who are the recovery-friendly employers? All that can be a place, or all that can be learned in an employment support group that's recovery-friendly. And there's other ways you can create more recovery-friendly support services. Sober activities, recovery skills development. You know, the list goes on, and most of these recovery community organizations are providing these kinds of services. So, yeah, we're pretty close to the end there. So that's the website for Faces and Voices of Recovery. If you have not ever been there, I would encourage you to go to the website. There's lots of good resources about recovery there. You can also sign on to get our emails through our listserv. If you go to their website and click this button, our regions, it'll show you a map of the United States, and if you're from California, you press that button, and you'll see a picture of me, because I'm the California representative, and it'll say to you, would you like to be receiving emails from Faces and Voices? So you click that button, and every now and then, usually several times a week, an email will come to you about a recovery-oriented issue through the Faces and Voices system. Okay. Right.
That was what Harmony used to be
Right.
down in San Diego. And I would bring women in from the community to help on Saturdays to help teach women, like some of the women never voted, how to write the legal women voters, and I brought professionals in to help them write resumes. And of course, then it went all to clinical.
Professional.
Professional, which.
Yeah, there's an element of old wine and new bottles here. Another way to think about this is if you really want to build recovery in a community, you want to be thinking wholesale. You don't want to be thinking retail. Right? Treatment is retail. It's expensive, hard to find, one at a time. Building recovery capital, creating recovery-friendly communities, is more about the wholesale model. How do you reach more people with limited dollars or the same amount of dollars? Yeah. Okay, so let's go through this quiz, and then you can see how you did or what you need to learn, and then we can call it a day, because I'm sure you all would rather be outside there baking in the sun. We're trying to figure out where to have dinner tonight. So, number one, recovery-oriented systems of care are, it's really A and C? No. It's really A, client-centered. All the rest are not part of this approach. 2, family and others are never incorporated into the recovery process. False. They always are. And recovery-oriented systems of care engage family members and allies. In fact, this recovery coach training that we're going to be doing in San Diego, we have several people who are allies, and they're going through this so they can coach other family members and allies. So yeah. You want to come? Starting Monday for 5 days? Well, let's talk when this is over. We're going to offer it again probably later in the summer, early in the fall. And there is a fee, although for some people who will be volunteering at Stepping Stone, the fee is really dramatically reduced because they're paying with their volunteer time. Number 3, providing individualized, comprehensive, stage-appropriate services means that the care system adapts to the needs of the client, supports the client across the lifespan, uses the stages of change, and the answer is D, both A and B. 4, the continuity of care in a recovery-oriented system of care provides a continuum of services which enhance recovery and decrease relapse, decrease, addiction crises. 5, collaboration and client self-management are hallmark characteristics of the recovery-oriented system of care, and that's true. 6, recovery-oriented systems of care coordinate/integrate efforts across service systems such as criminal justice, primary health care, vocational training, take your pick, all those things that people need to get their lives back on track, not just addiction treatment. 7, protecting the rights of people in recovery is an important element of a recovery-oriented system of care. So yes, that's true. We have a program at Stepping Stone that we developed a couple of years ago. When I came there 4 years ago, one of the things that was very evident to me was that our clients were marginalized in a number of ways. They were lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, which is a marginalized group in this country. They were recovering drug addicts and alcoholics, marginalized there. Many of them are HIV positive, so they're marginalized there. So we developed a program at Stepping Stone called Stepping Up, and it was designed to train our clients to be good self-advocates, which is, kind of consistent with treatment. You want people to be able to speak up, be assertive when they go down to the SSI office to apply or to apply for benefits. Want them to be good self-advocates. What was different, though, and controversial, was that we were also saying to them, you need to be involved in changing our society. Now, maybe not when you get out of treatment right away, but at some point in your recovery, consider Faces and Voices of Recovery. Consider some of the HIV or marriage equality organizations that are trying to change society. We believe that it was important for people to hear in treatment that good long-term recovery is also about being involved in the community in very proactive ways. It isn't just about going to your step meetings, period.
Well, I was involved in a thing called Don't Use Our Cans, Sell Your Cans.
Oh yeah, right.
Remember that?
I remember it.
20-some years ago. And that was that's what you're saying in the first place.
Yes, and the cans were,
Women's cans.
right.
And beer cans.
T&A, right, to sell Budweiser.
And then we also did, we did a whole thing on youth access to alcohol. So we picketed, my kids and I picketed Legoland because they wanted to apply for a liquor license.
Right.
And a program that was 6 to 12 year olds.
And, you know, these are ways that the recovery community, which historically has been kind of focused on itself, can really be involved in the broader community and really changing culture, changing society and attitudes. Okay, number 8, a recovery process that combines Native American cultural values along with traditional 12 steps of AA is called, and it's Wellbriety. Wellbriety. If you Google Wellbriety, W-E-L-L-B-R-E-I-T-Y, you'll find a whole Native American system for helping Native American communities become more recovery friendly and deal with the addiction of Native American individuals. Wellbriety was designed by an organization called White Bison, which is strictly about recovery for Native Americans. Okay, name 5 of the guiding principles of recovery. Well, here are some of them, and these are from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration guiding principles of recovery. Probably the most important, there are many pathways to recovery. It isn't just 12-step or methadone or smart recovery. There are a lot of different paths into recovery. We don't make a value judgment at Faces and Voices that this one's better than that one. They're all equal. And I was happy to see that there was a smart recovery workshop here. Yes, he is. I know Tom very well. My son spent the past 3 months working as one of his night managers. Smart recovery, for those of you who don't know, it's an alternative to 12-step treatment or 12-step mutual aid. And at Stepping Stone about 2 years ago, we had a number of our clients come to us and say, you know, we go to these meetings all the time. Is there anything else? So we reached out to Tom, had him come over and talk to our staff about smart recovery. So now, in addition to having several 12-step meetings and AA, we now have a smart recovery meeting on Saturday afternoons. Another principle, besides many pathways, is that recovery is self-directing and empowering. And if you talk to Tom at any length, he has some very interesting things to say about how traditionally some people view 12-step approaches as unempowering because it's, you know, you have a disease, you have to turn your life over, you're powerless. So there's some very interesting conversations around that, but we're not going to get into that. Another principle, guiding principle of recovery is the personal recognition of the need to change, that an individual and the recovery-oriented system of care recognizes the need to change, and that recovery is supported by peers and allies. It's based on hope and gratitude. It addresses discrimination, shame, and stigma in the community. So it's again kind of getting out of yourself into the community, interacting with the community. Those are some of the guiding principles of recovery. Number 10, peers as well as family members form vital support networks for people in recovery. Receiving support, guidance, and information from others who are committed to recovery can enhance a person's recovery. That is true. 11, the principal federal law that protects people in recovery from discrimination is the Disabilities Act. Let me tell you just one brief story about why that's important to the recovery community. I don't see anybody here that's old enough to remember the early days of CNN. But if you go back to the early days of CNN, the first talk show they had, the progenitor to Larry King, was called Talk Back Live with Susan Rook. And Susan was a young woman who had a very good, communication style and presentation, and she had this talk show. She was very successful. She was also a cocaine addict. And she left the show. A few years later, she entered long-term recovery. And after a couple of years of kind of getting her life back in order, she was recruited by an international educational firm to be their vice president of communications. And during the recruitment process, she met with the HR director and then this vice president and that vice president. And finally they said to her, well, you know, we want you to start on such and such a day. Here's your salary. She accepted the position, and they said, there's just one thing you have to do. You have to go upstairs and talk to the CEO. He always likes to meet all the new people, the new hires, so it's kind of a formality. Go up there and have a chat with him. So she goes into the CEO's office, sits down, and they're chatting, and she says to him, "Do you have any questions about my recovery?" His jaw drops. He looks at her, and she realizes he doesn't know. And he says, "Recovery from what?" And she said, "Well, I'm a recovering drug addict. And I'm surprised you don't know, because I've been very open about this. In fact, it was at one of my public presentations about my background that your recruiter approached me, and this whole process started." And then the CEO looked at her and said, "Whatever made you think we would want somebody like you to represent us?" He withdrew the job offer. She left his office embarrassed. And he had just violated federal law because he made an employment decision based solely on her recovery status. But when she went to her 12-step sponsor and said, "What should I do about this?" the advice she got from the 12-step sponsor was, "Get used to it. This is the way we're treated." Today, she thinks if she had known then what she knows now, she would have sued his ass, because he did violate federal law, and he violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. Not many people going through recovery, going through treatment, hear from their counselor about these kinds of issues, though. They hear about go to 30 meetings, they hear about, relapse, they hear about triggers, but they don't hear that, when you go back to your employer, maybe you don't want to talk about your recovery because discrimination still is alive and well in the United States, and it may not be a good thing to do. Or if they have a client who's been discriminated against, not many counselors know that the ADA is there as a remedy. So this is another way we need to kind of move outside of the black box of treatment. So finally, the new recovery movement is about organizing individuals in recovery to create a constituency of consequence. And you know the answer to that because that's how we started this conversation. So you all get my gold star for being here. And I hope this was interesting and helpful. And stay in touch. There's information, I think, on... Well, I have a card, and you can reach me. Let me give you my email. Email is Solanda, SOLANDA, at sbcglobal.org. The other way to meet me or send me an email is through the Faces and Voices website. If you go to the California icon, it says, "Send an email to John D. Miranda."